The year is 1488. A 12-year-old girl stands in the tallest tower of Château de Nantes, her small hands gripping the cold stone windowsill until her knuckles turn white. Below, enemy banners spread across the Breton countryside like a plague of locusts. The wind carries the acrid smell of smoke from burning villages, and in the distance, she hears the faint clash of steel on steel. This isn't how queens are meant to be made. Anne of Brittany presses her face against the window, her breath fogging the glass as she watches her world fall apart. The weight of a duchy, an entire people, rests on shoulders that should carry only a child's concerns. But childhood ended for Anne the moment her father's labored breathing stopped echoing through these stone halls. Now she is Duchess of Brittany, the last hope of a proud Celtic nation, and powerful men across Europe are already deciding her fate, like merchants haggling over a prized mare. She doesn't know it yet, but she will be forced to marry 3 times. She will endure at least 14 pregnancies, watching child after child slip away like morning mist. She will be passed from one conqueror to another, each marriage a political shackle disguised as a golden crown. This is the story of how a little girl became the most tragic queen in European history, and how she somehow found the strength to fight back. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please, comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand Anne's tragedy, you must understand what Brittany was and what it meant to lose it. Imagine a land where ancient Celtic traditions still whispered through oak groves, where the Breton language flowed like honey on the tongues of fishermen and farmers, where proud dukes had ruled independently for centuries, while the rest of Europe shifted like sand around them. Brittany was the last free Celtic nation, a stubborn thorn in the side of an expanding French kingdom. When Anne's father, Duke Francis II, died in 1488, he left no male heirs, only 2 daughters, with Anne as the elder. In a world where women were considered property to be traded, inherited, or conquered, this was both Anne's curse and her opportunity. The moment news of Francis's death reached the royal courts of Europe, the vultures began circling. King Charles V of France, barely older than Anne herself, saw an opportunity to finally absorb Brittany into his growing empire. The Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian saw her as a potential pawn in his endless chess game with France. Meanwhile, Anne stood in her father's tomb, tears streaming down her face, unaware that powerful men were already drafting marriage contracts with her name. At 13, Anne made a desperate move, secretly marrying Maximilian by proxy, a decision that would have been considered treasonous by the French court. The emperor wasn't even present. A stand-in held Anne's trembling hand as she spoke vows to a man she'd never met, in a language she barely understood. This was a political alliance disguised as marriage, intended to secure Brittany's protection from French aggression through the Holy Roman Empire. However, Anne underestimated the ruthlessness of young kings. Charles V of France wasn't about to let his prize slip away to a Habsburg emperor. In 1491, French armies swept across Brittany with overwhelming force, capturing fortress after fortress, cutting off supply lines, and tightening the noose around Anne's neck. Picture a 15-year-old girl on the battlements of Rennes, watching French banners multiply on the horizon. Her advisors spoke in urgent tones behind her, their words blurring into meaningless noise. The reality was stark. Brittany couldn't win this war. The French had more men, more resources, and more time. Anne's proxy marriage to Maximilian proved to be a mere paper shield against a very real threat. The siege of Rennes dragged on for months. Inside the city, food grew scarce, and Anne could hear the distant thunder of French cannons testing the walls. She likely wondered if Maximilian would come to her aid, if the promised armies of the Holy Roman Empire would appear like salvation. They never came. In the game of European politics, Anne discovered that promises to young girls were worth less than the parchment they were written on. By winter, the choice was clear: surrender or watch her people starve. Anne chose surrender, but Charles VIII's terms were harsh. She had to renounce her marriage to Maximilian and marry Charles himself. The conqueror demanding the conquered as his bride was a pattern as old as warfare. On December 6, 1491, Anne stood in the Cathedral of Langres, her hands shaking as she placed them in Charles's. She was barely 16. He was 21. The ceremony was magnificent, with cloth of gold, precious stones, and hundreds of witnesses. But Anne's eyes were hollow. She was signing away Breton independence, and she knew it. The marriage contract was particularly cruel, stipulating that if Charles died before her, she would be required to marry his successor. She wasn't just becoming a queen, she was becoming a hereditary asset of the French crown, to be passed from one king to the next like a prized jewel. The girl who had once defiantly stood in the towers of Nantes was now legally barred from escaping French control. Their wedding night was a display of royal brutality masked as ceremony. Charles, barely out of his teens, was not known for his gentleness. Anne, raised in the relative freedom of Breton court culture, was unprepared for the harsh realities of a French royal marriage. What happened in that ornate bedchamber at Langres was not love. It was conquest in its most intimate form. Yet Anne was stronger than anyone had imagined. Within months, she was pregnant. The French court celebrated an heir to solidify the union of Brittany and France. Anne must have felt a complex mix of emotions: hope that this child might grant her some power, fear of what carrying a conqueror's child meant for her soul, and the devastating knowledge that she was now trapped forever. The child was born dead. This pattern would define Anne's life: hope followed by crushing loss, pregnancy followed by grief. In the medieval world, infant mortality was common, but Anne's losses were extraordinary even by those standards. She endured at least 14 documented pregnancies, most ending in miscarriage, stillbirth, or infant death. Imagine the psychological toll. Each pregnancy brought the possibility of securing her position, of giving France the heir it desperately wanted, of proving her worth in a world that measured royal women by their ability to produce sons. Each loss was not just personal grief, but political failure, another mark against her in the ruthless ledger of royal expectations. Meanwhile, Charles proved as ineffective a ruler as he was a cruel husband. He became obsessed with his claim to the throne of Naples, spending vast sums on Italian military campaigns while neglecting his own kingdom's governance. Anne effectively ruled France, while Charles played at being a conqueror abroad. During one of these Italian adventures, fate intervened in an unexpected way. In 1498, Charles VIII was walking through the galleries of Château d'Amboise when he struck his head on a low doorway. He collapsed immediately and died within hours. The king who had forced Anne into marriage was dead at 27, leaving behind no surviving children. Anne was free, but only briefly. According to her marriage contract, she was now required to marry Charles's successor, Louis XIV. But Louis had a problem. He was already married to Joan of France, the daughter of Louis XIV. The solution was typically medieval in its cynical efficiency. Louis sought an annulment from the Pope, claiming his marriage to Joan was invalid. The annulment process was a masterpiece of royal manipulation. Louis claimed that Joan was physically deformed and unable to consummate their marriage, despite their 20-year union. Joan, a devout woman devoted to serving her husband, faced public humiliation as church lawyers scrutinized intimate details of her body and marriage. Anne observed these proceedings with growing horror, seeing her own future reflected in Joan's ordeal. Royal women were seen not as individuals, but as problems to solve, obstacles to remove, or resources to redistribute. When Joan was finally sent to a convent, Anne realized she could face a similar fate. However, Anne had learned from her first marriage that even a trapped queen could wield power if clever enough. When Louis XIV sought her hand, Anne surprised everyone by negotiating. She agreed to marry Louis, but demanded concessions. Brittany would retain certain privileges. She would have a say in their children's succession, and she secured a promise that if Louis died before her, she wouldn't be forced to marry his successor, giving her the freedom to choose her own future. The negotiations were a masterclass in royal diplomacy. At 22, hardened by loss and betrayal, Anne faced down Europe's most powerful king and extracted promises that seemed impossible for a woman in her position. She used her political value to carve out small spaces of autonomy within royal marriage. The wedding in 1499 was vastly different from her first. Anne was no longer the terrified teenager who trembled before Charles VIII. She was a queen who had buried children, ruled a kingdom, and survived European political machinations. Placing her hand in Louis's was not surrender, but negotiation. Louis XIV was a different husband than Charles. Where Charles was brutal and impulsive, Louis was calculating and patient, understanding that Anne was not just a wife, but a political partner, essential to his reign. Their marriage, though fundamentally coercive, developed into something resembling mutual respect. Anne embraced her new role with fierce determination, blending French sophistication with Breton traditions, creating patronage networks to extend her influence, and ensuring Brittany retained its unique identity within France. Yet, the ghosts of her lost children haunted her. Each pregnancy brought hope and terror equally. She managed her expectations, preparing for loss while praying for success. The psychological armor she had developed was both impressive and heartbreaking. She had trained herself not to hope too much for her own children. In 1501, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Claude, who thrived and became the light of Anne's life. For the first time in years, Anne experienced the joy of successful motherhood. However, even this happiness was tinged with political reality. Claude was a daughter, not the desperately needed son of France. Anne's subsequent pregnancies followed the familiar pattern of loss: sons who lived only days, daughters who never drew breath, an endless cycle of hope and grief, defining royal motherhood in an age of primitive medicine and political pressure. Each loss was both a personal tragedy and a state crisis, another failure in Anne's primary duty as queen. The political implications of these losses were enormous. Without a male heir, the succession remained uncertain. Anne's inability to produce sons was seen as divine judgment, suggesting perhaps the union of Brittany and France was not blessed by God, courtiers whispered. Foreign ambassadors sent coded messages to their masters, while Anne felt the weight of an entire kingdom's future pressing on her shoulders. But Anne found power in unexpected places. She became a patron of the arts, commissioning works to celebrate Breton culture and history. She established schools and hospitals, creating lasting institutions. She carefully managed her daughter Claude's education, ensuring she was prepared for the brutal realities of royal life. In 1514, after 15 years of marriage to Louis XIV, Anne faced her greatest test. Louis, now 52 and in poor health, was considering remarriage after Anne's death to secure the succession. Although he had promised to honor their marriage contract, he was already making plans that could undo everything Anne had fought for. Anne responded swiftly and decisively, arranging for Claude to be betrothed to Francis of Angoulême, Louis's heir presumptive. This brilliant political move ensured Claude would marry the next king, securing both her daughter's future and Brittany's continued connection to the French throne. If Anne couldn't produce sons, she would at least ensure her daughter's sons would rule. But the effort exhausted her. Years of political maneuvering, repeated pregnancies, and constant stress took their toll. Anne's health began to fail in the winter of 1513. She was only 36, but she had lived several lifetimes' worth of tragedy and struggle. As she lay dying in the Château de Blois, Anne must have reflected on her impossible situation. Forced to marry 3 times, endure 14 pregnancies, watch most of her children die, and sacrifice her homeland's independence on the altar of political necessity. Yet, she had also negotiated unprecedented autonomy for a royal woman, preserved elements of Breton culture, and secured her daughter's future. The irony was profound. Anne, who had been passed from one husband to another and treated as property rather than a person, somehow became one of the most powerful women in European history. She learned to navigate the oppressive system, finding agency amidst subjugation, protecting what she could while accepting what she couldn't change. Anne died on January 9, 1514, at 36. Her last words were reportedly a prayer for Brittany, a final acknowledgement of the homeland she was forced to sacrifice. The girl who once stood in the towers of Nantes, watching enemy armies approach, became a queen who shaped the destiny of nations even as she was shaped by forces beyond her control. Her funeral was magnificent, befitting a queen who ruled 2 kingdoms and influenced Europe's fate. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from the common people of Brittany, who lined the roads as her body made its final journey. They remembered her not as the queen who married their conquerors, but as the daughter who tried to save them, preserving what she could of their culture and identity. To truly understand Anne's tragedy and triumph, we need to delve deeper into the moments that shaped her, the intimate details of a life lived under impossible circumstances, the small rebellions that added up to something resembling freedom, and the cost of survival in a world that viewed women as nothing more than walking wombs and political assets. Let's return to that first wedding night at Langeais. In 1491, Anne, 16 and trembling, stood in the ornate bedchamber as servants prepared her for her duties as wife to Charles VIII. The room was decorated with tapestries depicting scenes of conquest. How grimly appropriate. The bed itself was a monument to royal excess, carved with symbols of French power that must have felt like mockery to a girl who had just signed away her homeland's independence. What the official chronicles don't tell you is that Anne wept. Not the delicate tears of a romantic bride, but the raw, desperate sobs of a prisoner who finally understood the full scope of her captivity. Her ladies-in-waiting, themselves products of aristocratic marriages arranged for political gain, offered what comfort they could. But what comfort could there be? Anne was about to be initiated into the most intimate form of conquest, and everyone in that room understood the reality behind the ceremonial pomp. Charles entered the chamber with the swagger of a young man who had never been denied anything he wanted. At 21, he was already showing signs of the physical and mental instability that would define his reign. His appearance was striking in all the wrong ways. His jaw jutted out, his nose hooked, and his eyes seemed to look through people rather than at them. This was the man who would father Anne's children, share her bed, and have unlimited access to her body for the rest of his life. The consummation was brutal. Medieval marriage contracts required witnesses to confirm the union was properly completed, so Anne's humiliation was not private. The blood-stained sheets were displayed as proof of her virginity and the marriage's validity, reducing her most intimate moment to a matter of state record. But that night, Anne learned something vital. Survival required an internal fortification that had nothing to do with castle walls or armies. She discovered she could separate her mind from her body, endure what couldn't be changed, while preserving an essential part of herself that remained untouchable. This skill would serve her well in the years to come. The early months of her marriage to Charles were a masterclass in royal humiliation. The French court, triumphant over Brittany, treated Anne like a prized captive rather than a queen. Courtiers would bow to her face and snicker behind her back, making jokes about the Breton mare and placing bets on how long it would take her to produce an heir. Anne endured these slights with outward grace, but inside, she was cataloging every insult, every slight, every moment of disrespect. She was learning the true cost of conquest, not just the loss of political independence, but the systematic destruction of personal dignity. Her first pregnancy came quickly, as expected. The French court celebrated with premature enthusiasm, already planning the christening of the prince who would cement the union of Brittany and France. Meanwhile, Anne experienced the peculiar mix of hope and terror that would characterize all her pregnancies. Would this child be her salvation or her doom? Would motherhood give her power or simply provide another weapon for her enemies? The pregnancy was difficult from the start. Anne suffered from persistent nausea, debilitating headaches, and a strange sense of foreboding she couldn't shake. The court physicians, men who understood politics better than medicine, assured everyone these were normal symptoms, signs of a strong child growing in her womb. But Anne's body told her otherwise. She lost the baby in her 6th month. The child was born developed enough for everyone to see it would have been the son France desperately needed. Anne held the tiny, perfectly formed body in her arms, this prince who would never rule. This child who had died before drawing a single breath. The grief was overwhelming, but what made it unbearable was the immediate shift in how she was treated. The moment the child's death was confirmed, Anne shifted from a cherished vessel to a potential problem. The whispers began immediately. Was she cursed? Was God punishing France? Could she bear healthy children at all? Charles's reaction was revealing. He showed no grief for the lost child, no concern for Anne's well-being. Instead, he quickly calculated when she could conceive again. The baby was scarcely cold before discussion started on how to optimize Anne's next pregnancy. She realized with stark clarity that she was not a grieving wife, but a failed breeding project needing recalibration. The second pregnancy came within months. Anne's body had barely recovered from the first loss when she found herself expecting again. This time, she was determined to do everything perfectly. She followed every physician's advice, every midwife's superstition, and every priest's prayer. She ate foods to encourage male children, slept in positions believed to prevent miscarriage, and wore amulets promising divine protection. None of it mattered. The second child lived only 3 days. Anne held her dying son as his breathing grew shallow, watching life fade from his eyes while courtiers whispered about succession implications. She realized she was trapped in a nightmare with no escape, condemned to endure pregnancy after pregnancy, loss after loss, each failure making her more vulnerable to those who saw her as an obstacle to be removed. The pattern repeated with horrifying regularity. Pregnancy, hope, loss, blame, and immediate pressure to conceive again. Anne's body became a battleground for the future of nations, and she was losing every battle. The physical toll was enormous. Constant pregnancies and miscarriages left her weak, anemic, and prematurely aged. But the psychological damage was perhaps worse. She developed a protective numbness, a way of experiencing hope without fully believing in it. preparing for loss even as she prayed for success. Meanwhile, Charles was proving as incompetent a king as he was a callous husband. His obsession with the Italian wars consumed vast resources and attention, leaving France's internal affairs to others. Anne stepped into the void, managing correspondence, meeting with ministers, and making decisions that should have been Charles's responsibility. Ironically, she gained real political power just as her personal life became a catalogue of losses. The Italian campaigns also provided Anne some respite from the relentless pressure to conceive. When Charles was away playing soldier, she focused on governance rather than pregnancy. During these times of relative freedom, she glimpsed what she might have achieved if she had been born male or lived in a different era. She proved herself a skilled administrator, a thoughtful policymaker, and a capable diplomat. But these accomplishments were always overshadowed by her main duty, producing an heir for France. Anne's relationship with Charles was complex and evolving. She never loved him. How could she love the man who conquered her homeland and forced her into marriage? Yet, she learned to work with him, manipulate him when necessary, and find ways to advance her own agenda within their relationship's constraints. She discovered that Charles, despite his cruelty, was deeply insecure and dependent on her in ways he didn't fully understand. This gave her leverage, small spaces where she could exert influence and protect what mattered to her. One of Anne's most significant acts of subtle rebellion was her patronage of Breton culture. While she couldn't prevent Brittany's political absorption into France, she ensured Breton traditions, language, and customs were preserved and celebrated. She commissioned artworks depicting Breton history, supported scholars studying Breton literature, and maintained a court culture that honored her homeland's heritage. These may seem like small gestures, but they were acts of cultural resistance that helped preserve Breton identity for future generations. Anne also built networks of female power that transcended traditional political boundaries. She corresponded with other queens and noblewomen across Europe, sharing information, offering support, and creating informal alliances that operated outside the male-dominated diplomatic sphere. These relationships provided her with practical advantages and emotional support during her darkest times. Charles V's death in 1498 was both liberation and new trauma for Anne. She was finally free from a marriage that brought her only pain, but she immediately faced the prospect of another forced union. Louis XIV's pursuit of an annulment from his wife Joan was a stark reminder that royal marriages were business transactions, not personal relationships. Anne watched Joan's public humiliation with a mix of sympathy and terror, knowing she was witnessing her potential future. But Anne was no longer the terrified 16-year-old dragged to the altar at Longueuil. At 22, hardened by years of loss and political maneuvering, she had learned to use her value as a political asset to extract concessions from those who sought to use her. Her negotiations with Louis XIV were a masterpiece of strategic thinking, proving she had transformed from victim to player in the game of European politics. The terms she negotiated were unprecedented for a woman in her position. She secured guarantees for Brittany's autonomy, provisions for her financial security, and most importantly, a promise that if Louis died before her, she wouldn't be forced to marry his successor. These concessions marked a fundamental shift in the power dynamics of royal marriage. Anne had managed to create spaces for agency within a system meant to deny her any autonomy. Her second wedding, to Louis XIV in 1499, was very different from her first. Anne entered this marriage not as a conquered prize, but as a negotiating partner who had secured terms to protect her interests. She was still compelled to marry against her will, but she had imposed her own conditions on the arrangement. It was a small victory, but in her life, small victories were everything. Louis XIV was a very different kind of husband from Charles V. Where Charles had been brutal and neglectful, Louis was calculating and attentive. He understood that Anne was not just a wife, but a political asset, whose cooperation was vital to his success. Their marriage, though still fundamentally coercive, developed into something resembling a working partnership. Louis treated Anne with respect, born of pragmatism rather than affection. Yet it was a vast improvement over her previous experience. Anne embraced her new role with determination. She established a court that was both sophisticated and uniquely her own, blending French grandeur with Breton traditions to honor both cultures. She became a patron of the arts, commissioning works that celebrated women's achievements and Breton heritage. She created charitable institutions, providing practical help to women and children, using her position to address issues typically ignored by male rulers. However, the specter of pregnancy and loss continued to haunt her. Each time she conceived, Anne faced the familiar mix of hope and dread, learning to manage her expectations and prepare for disappointment, even as she prayed for success. The emotional armor she developed was psychologically necessary, but heartbreaking a woman who trained herself not to hope too much for her own children, because hope made the losses unbearable. The birth of Claude in 1501 was a moment of pure joy in Anne's life. After years of losses, she finally had a child who lived, who thrived, and who brought light into her existence. But even this happiness was complicated by political reality. Claude was a daughter, not the son France needed, and Anne knew that her failure to produce a male heir would continue to be held against her. Anne's relationship with Claude was intense and complex. She was determined to prepare her daughter for the realities of royal life, while protecting her from the worst aspects of her own experience. She personally oversaw Claude's education, ensuring her daughter learned not only traditional feminine skills, but also the political savvy needed to navigate a world where women were often seen as pawns in men's power games. Anne's life was dominated by a relentless cycle of pregnancy and loss. Each miscarriage was both a personal tragedy and a political crisis, marking another failure in her primary duty as queen. The physical toll was immense. Anne's health suffered under the constant strain, but the psychological impact was perhaps even more devastating. She lived in a state of continual grief, never fully recovering from one loss before facing another. In her final years, Anne raced against time. Aware of her failing health, she was determined to secure her daughter's future before it was too late. Arranging Claude's betrothal to Francis of Angoulême was a brilliant political move, ensuring Claude would marry the future king. Anne safeguarded her daughter's position and the interests of Brittany. This was the peak of years of strategic political maneuvering. The irony of Anne's death was profound. She had spent her adult life being passed from one husband to another, treated as property, enduring pregnancy after pregnancy for political aims she never chose. Yet she became one of the most influential women in European history, shaping the destiny of nations while being shaped by uncontrollable forces. Anne's legacy is complex and multifaceted. She failed in her primary duty as defined by her time, never producing the male heir France desperately needed. Yet she succeeded in preserving Breton culture, advancing women's education and welfare, and creating a model for royal women to exercise agency within systems designed to deny them power. She transformed from victim to survivor, finding ways to protect what mattered most, even when everything else was lost. The young girl who stood in the tower at Nantes, watching enemy armies approach, could never have imagined her future. But she might have recognized the strength needed to survive such a life, and the courage required to keep fighting, even when victory seemed impossible. Anne of Brittany was indeed a child queen forced to marry her executioner, but she was also much more. she discovered that even in the darkest times, small spaces exist where hope can flourish, love can persist, and the human spirit can endure and even triumph. Her story reminds us that history is not just about kings, battles, and grand political movements. This story is also about people caught in situations beyond their control, those who manage to save what they can, discovering that sometimes the greatest victories go unnoticed. Anne preserved what she could of her world, capturing the essence of humanity in the face of overwhelming odds. The wind continues to blow through the towers of Nantes, bringing the salty scent of the sea and the whispers of those who lived before. If you listen closely, you might hear the echo of a young girl's voice, defiant and determined, promising that love, hope, and memories will endure long after armies have vanished and conquerors have turned to dust. Anne's daughter, Claude, married Francis IV and became Queen of France, continuing a lineage that would rule for centuries. Yet, Claude's path differed greatly from her mother's. She enjoyed the freedom of marrying by choice rather than through conquest, entering a political but non-coercive union. The cycle of forced marriage and political subjugation that defined Anne's life was broken by Anne herself. Through strategic planning and tough negotiations, she ensured her daughter had choices she never had. From her tower in Nantes, 12-year-old Anne couldn't have imagined her future. Forced to marry her conqueror, losing child after child, becoming France's most powerful woman, yet still trapped by the system that elevated her. But perhaps you would recognize the strength needed to endure such a life. Perhaps you would understand that sometimes true rebellion lies in persistence, in the quiet determination to protect what you can. Anne of Brittany was a child queen forced to marry her conqueror, but she was also more a woman who found agency even in the darkest circumstances, where love and hope could survive. The girl in the tower became a woman who saved her world, turning conquest into negotiation and survival into a form of victory. In the end, perhaps that's all we can hope for, to confront forces that threaten us and find ways to preserve what truly matters, even when all else is lost. The wind still blows through the towers of Nantes, carrying the sea's salty scent and the whispered stories of the past. Sometimes, if you listen closely, you can hear the echo of a young girl's voice, defiant and determined, assuring us that certain things, love, hope, and the memory of who we were, will endure long after the armies have marched on and the conquerors have turned to dust.